What if you had a guide who could tell you how to bridge a gap between who you are today and who you're destined to be? What if each week you could hear a story of someone who has tried and succeeded, or perhaps tried and failed, but learned something in the process? Limitless Spirit is a weekly podcast where host Helen Todd interviews guests about topics and personal stories on defining life's purpose, pursuing personal growth, and developing a deeper faith in Christ.
A really good friend of mine who works here in Washington works for an international exchange program for the Fulbright program at Department of State. And there are a handful of Afghan girls who, I think not just girls, young people who had just gotten accepted on a Fulbright to come to the United States to study. And they had their plane tickets, everything, their lives were ready to change this semester. And in an instant, it's been taken away. Their futures, they had worked so hard for what was to come. And in an instant, they are now no longer allowed to be educated in this way. And to be that close for a lot of these young women is it's almost too much to bear, the thought of it.
This was Charles Davidson, today's guest on the Limitless Spirit podcast. I'm your host, Helen Todd. I have known Charles since he was an ambitious 22-year-old college student with a heart to help the underdeveloped nations, and he traveled with our organization, World Missions Alliance, to Iraq to start a school. Afterwards, his passion to help took him to Afghanistan, and he spent time in Kabul teaching English. Today, Dr. Davidson serves as research faculty at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University in Washington, D.C. He specializes in civil war and political conflict. He is also the president of Innovations in Peacebuilding International, which works to creatively accompany peace in war-torn countries. I wanted to get his input on what is ahead for the people of Afghanistan and how can we pray in an informed way for this nation. Charles's approach is unique because it combines a scholarly view with the perspective of a believer in Christ. Let's dive into this interview. Hello, Charles. Welcome to the Limitless Spirit podcast. How are you today?
Hi, Helen. I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Well, we haven't seen each other in a few years, ever since you moved to Washington, D.C., far away from Missouri. And I think perhaps our last in-person contact was when you traveled to Iraq with World Missions Alliance. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it was, my goodness, 2008, maybe?
Really?
Long time ago.
That has been a long time. Well, and back then you were at college. Were you still in college or you were a graduate?
Yeah, I was still in college. I think I was in my senior year.
And that was at the University of Arkansas.
That's right. Yeah.
And so you had, even then as a young man, you had the heart for the nations. So you had a vision of starting a school in post-war Iraq. So that's what really connected you with our organization. And so on that trip, you were very successful at launching it. And then you even stayed there a little longer to make sure that it all happened. And then you traveled to some other world hotspots. And specifically, I want to talk to you today about your time you spent in Afghanistan, since this is something that is on everybody's mind right now with the crisis in Kabul and in Afghanistan in general unfolding. So what took you to Afghanistan?
Yeah, so, part of the reason why I, as a young man, contacted was I had a vision for impacting war-torn countries in a sustainable way that could accompany peace processes with the local people. My inspiration was that we could find really good ideas in places that could be nurtured and grown with some outside assistance, especially financially and things like that. And so I went to my pastor of all people and said, "Hey, I've got this idea." And he was like, "How old are you?" And I said, "22." He was kind of making a point. He said, "Well, this is all really great and these ideas are all noble, but you don't know much about what you're wanting to do. So I recommend you leave and go and learn. Travel the world if you can and find out more about, what can actually be accomplished." And so I was incredibly lucky to land a job as an English teacher with NATO in Afghanistan. And that was part of that first stepping out and learning about what life is like in war-torn countries. So I was in Afghanistan for almost a year.
So what year was that?
2008 and 2009 is when I was there.
And did you live in Kabul?
I did. Yep. In fact, I lived at the airport, where we're seeing so much transpiring these days. I, as a civilian and not military, was allowed to go, as they say, outside the wire, and go into town. And I had somewhat of a normal life in Kabul. Would go to the market and found the shopping mall and had favorite restaurants, and I had a taxi driver who I could trust to come pick me up. And I even found an expat church that I would go to on Sundays, which not while not quite as dangerous as being an Afghan Christian, was still a bit tense at times. So I got the full experience of actually living in Kabul, if only from time to time.
And so, who were the people that you taught English?
So they were Afghan National Air Corps pilots, air traffic controllers, and other people who were involved in what could be kind of compared to their air force. And the idea was to teach them English because English is the international language of flight, and so they needed to learn to do that properly.
So during that time, did you develop personal relationships with these people? Were you able to glean from them what their life is like and what are some of their struggles? What are some of their hopes?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, as any teacher would with any student, them being in my classroom for, 7 hours a day, certainly got to know lots about them. The Afghan people, it's incredibly, I think, tempting to overgeneralize and say, here's what they, do or want or see or need. I can tell you that, as with any other war-torn country, I've been to many of them. They're just like us. They have desires to be happy and healthy and raise successful families and be stable and have a job and be able to provide for their loved ones. And they have desires to celebrate and to have birthdays and weddings. And what happens is in places that are deeply impacted by conflict, you see this resilience that comes out in that desire for normalcy so much more boldly than in places like our country that are so incredibly stable. So what you see is all the normal things that you would expect from a person, just highlighted against the backdrop of violence and conflict.
And so with that, the year that you were there was the 7th year of the U.S. military presence, official military presence in Afghanistan. Do you think that, and I don't know if the people that you specifically were teaching represented the majority of the voices, but do you feel like overall the sentiment was that the people received that presence favorably? Was it a positive impact on their quality of life?
Do you mean the foreign military influence?
Yeah, the presence of the U.S. military there.
I think that you would be really hard-pressed to find anybody where I was, which is a more urban area. You would be really hard-pressed to find anybody that said that life was better before we came. But at the same time, this is a country that has been invaded and has been at war for decades and decades. And I can tell you what, I don't want to overgeneralize, but I think that the predominant sentiment was they just want peace. You had the Soviets, and then you had the civil war that occurred between different factions of Mujahideen that occurred after the Soviet Union left, and then that civil war was calmed by the arrival of the Taliban, and then the Taliban rule quickly fell apart into corruption and violence and a lack of human rights. And then there was another invasion by us, and then the occupation. And I think that, generally, it wasn't necessarily that life was better. It's that maybe life was a little bit more predictable, but still just, I think that Afghans really just want their country and to be left alone by outsiders.
So that brings me to the next question, because generally Afghanistan is this foreign mystery, if you will. We know that, especially here in the United States, we are aware that it was at one point invaded by the Soviet Union. Later, we brought in our troops as part of war on terror, also as part of helping Afghanistan regain stability. So in light of all that and the crisis that is happening now, what is a good outcome for Afghanistan without the presence of foreign troops, whether they're perceived as invaders or peacekeepers? Does Afghanistan have the ability within the country to have peace, stability, good, fair government?
Yeah. I obviously time is going to tell, but I don't see a stable, peaceful future under the Taliban. The only way that I see stability actually happening in Afghanistan is if people are kind of modeling what happened last night in Jalalabad, which was that protests have now started. And we've seen women protesting in the streets of Kabul. It ended violently, unfortunately, right? These people were shot, the crowd was shot into, people were beat. But the answer isn't just for Afghanistan. The answer is for any country that experiences a ruling party or a ruler that they don't like. It is the way forward is as a country to make use of your numbers and say, we reject this model of government and we want a new one. That's what we did as Americans. That's what a lot of countries have done after colonialization. And the only way forward for Afghans is in my opinion, that's the same. It's a hard reality to talk about. It's an incredibly tragic reality to talk about because that means more violence, as has already been shown.
Oh, and additionally, for that to happen, shouldn't there be a group or a leader that will organize that? I mean, unfortunately, we don't operate without some form of leadership. So my next question is there a group, maybe a political party or another organized group that is capable of leading the people of Afghanistan to that path of success? Or at least to the opposition to Taliban?
Sure. No, at present, I don't think there is. I don't think that there's a native political group. By native, I mean local Afghan political group that's organized or large enough, partially because the Taliban is made up of a lot of people of the Pashtun identity. And the Pashtun identity is the dominant ethnic identity in Afghanistan, and both in power and in numbers. What you saw after 96 was the Northern Alliance, which was primarily led by Tajik people, but they were largely limited to Tajik areas of Afghanistan, and because they were so much smaller, they couldn't, they couldn't really challenge the Taliban. But even if they did, their ability to govern all of Afghanistan, especially in largely held Pashtun areas, was going to be limited for the same reasons, because they were, a battling group, not a governing group, and this sort of like mixture of people who have the ability to rebel using force, but then also govern using political prowess is so rare in any of these types of situations, not just Afghanistan.
Well, from what you're saying, from the natural perspective, the future of Afghanistan seems very bleak and hopeless, because if there is no one who can, in an organized way, oppose Taliban... I
don't want to say it's hopeless, right? Because even though there's not a group that can be identified today, that doesn't mean that there won't be a group forming later. You may find that all of a sudden the shock of this moment is over, and the mystery of what is going to happen kind of mellows out, and who knows, maybe within just a few months we see a party or a group capable of mounting that challenge. Who knows what's going to happen? I think today it's so raw. The Band-Aid has been ripped off, and it's hard to say today who that would be.
And I love what you just said. I love that perspective that, what seems to be hopeless doesn't have to be. As a Christian, as a missionary myself, I always believe that the fate of the nation is not determined so much by the people, but by God and God's providence and God's plan. And so then I want to ask you, because even though we have not personally actively been involved in Afghanistan as an organization, but we want to, in an informed way, to pray for the future of this nation. The reason I asked you if there was a group or a party within Afghanistan that could foster a more peaceful and stable future is because we want to know how to pray. What do we specifically pray for? So as a Christian yourself, and also as a specialist in civil wars and conflict resolution, what would be some of the areas that you suggest we focus our prayers on?
Yeah. Number one, I would say be willing to pray for the resiliency of the Afghan people. Just in some ways, just love the Afghan people in your prayers. And they're facing yet another incredibly challenging chapter in their history. Many of whom who have lived through all of these. There's so many Afghans alive who were there during Soviet times. They've lived through all of this. If you're looking for something more proactive, I would say pray that the people who have the ability to mount a challenge to not allow this oppressive form of government to take hold, to find one another and to be able to mount the courage to be able to demonstrate resistance, and that they would be protected in that resistance, because it's you kind of harken back to the times of like the soccer stadium executions and stuff like that, and we really as a human race don't need another episode of that type of government. So praying for the boldness and the courage and the wherewithal to gather an opposition to say, no, we want our rights, we want our respect, we're people, and that the Taliban would respond to that with understanding rather than force. And saying it out loud is like, it sounds impossible, but I think that's the point where faith comes in, right? Like we
believe
we
the
pray
impossible.
for impossible things.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. Yeah. What about the church, the Christian church in Afghanistan? They would be, along with the Afghanis who cooperated with the U.S. government, the Christians in Afghanistan are another extremely vulnerable group of people right now. So how can we pray for the church in Afghanistan?
Yeah, so I don't know this for sure, what I'm about to say, but my hunch is that they weren't much safer a month ago than they are now. It has always been, unless I'm mistaken, it has always been illegal to convert to Christianity in Afghanistan, even after the Taliban were ousted. So my thought is that they're going to continue doing what they've always done in protecting themselves. And, I was made privy to some of those processes, and they are incredibly well versed in how to protect their identities and the identities of their loved ones. So pray for peace in their individual hearts, and pray for protection in their groups as they, kind of have to mount a new challenge of protecting their lives and their faith in this new season in Afghanistan. But overall, I think that in a lot of ways their faith as believers in a place where it's illegal to be a Christian is incredibly great. And so in a lot of ways, we could pray for ourselves to have that kind of faith.
and learn from them. I couldn't agree more with you. So, without jeopardizing their safety or any sources that you may have there, what is the state of the church in Afghanistan as far as the numbers of Christians and the popularity of Christian faith? What is your opinion on that?
I have no idea. That is a part of what they do well.
Is they
there's
protect
no way to measure
their
it.
privacy.
Oh yeah, it's at least when I was there, like I said, I would go to an expatriate church that was somewhat underground, out of view, but there was no way as an outsider to access that type of information. It is so incredibly secret that no one knows how to answer that question. I think that you could have people on the ground there who might be able to answer that question a little bit more accurately, who's kind of like their job was to be among those people. But even then, I just don't know if they could actually accurately speak to it, because many times people, from what I have understood and what I've seen, is that when an Afghan becomes a Christian, it's very, very secret. To the point where many Afghan leaders would, if they heard me saying this, would say, "There's no such thing as a Christian Afghan," but it's not true. There certainly are.
I understand. So, so Christians probably will not be in any more danger than they were before. But from my understanding, is the rule of Taliban will endanger much greater women, young girls, probably people who cooperated with the U.S. government during the presence of our troops there. Who else do you think? So these are the people groups that we can be praying for. So who are other people groups whose life will drastically change under the Taliban rule?
Yeah. I want to just make a quick caveat. Who knows what the Taliban is going to do with regard to the church? They may ramp it way up in an attempt to root them out in order to kind of purify this whole idea of the Islamic emirate, right, in their own eyes. So I don't want to say that the church is going to be experiencing the same challenges. I think I just don't understand the differences in those challenges yet. Women, certainly, for me, I think everybody is worse off. I don't see how there's a population that is now somehow going to be better off unless they are sympathizers with. With that being said, I think that the children are who we have to pray for, because this is now their future. For all intents and purposes, people talk a lot about young girls who now will likely not be educated except in religious matters, who will be forced into kind of the subservience that the Taliban espouses as being Islamic. Which is challengeable, obviously. But young boys too are going to be brought up in this idea that this is the way to practice Islam, and to be a man is to do X, Y, and Z, and it's an incredibly, incredibly skewed view of humanity. So all children at this point have had their futures radically altered. A really good friend of mine who works here in Washington works for an international exchange program for the Fulbright program at Department of State. And there are a handful of Afghan girls who, well, I think not just girls, young people who had just gotten accepted on a Fulbright to come to the United States to study, and they had their plane tickets, everything. Their lives were ready to change this semester, and in an instant, it's been taken away. Their futures, they had worked so hard for what was to come, and in an instant, they are now no longer allowed to be educated in this way. And to be that close for a lot of these young women is it's almost too much to bear, the thought of it.
And this is a very vivid example of how people's lives are going to change. This is a snapshot that we all can understand and relate to, and especially, me as a woman. So what is the solution, Charles? I mean, what has been done, and I don't want to go into discussing, how wrong this all was. What is done cannot be reversed, but what is the solution now? What can we do as a country to maybe not fix, but mitigate what is happening there?
Well, I want to say, if you don't mind, I want to just a couple more to your last question. because I feel like this needs to be said. There are other Afghans who are going to be in a lot more danger now as a result of this new power structure. And, the Hazara people who occupy a lot of the center of the country, they are Shia Muslim, and they are incredibly oppressed as a country and as a people in that country. And I think that we're going to see a rise in that. So if you have a particular people group, praying for them and other ethnic and religious minorities, not just Christians, but other people who might have worldviews different than the Taliban. The stories are almost unbearable about the last time the Taliban was in power in Afghanistan. Is how they treated ethnic and religious minorities are. We'll see if that changes this time around, but certainly have them in your prayers as well. So what is to be done or mitigated? That's such a big question. I think in the short term, we have to keep our promises. We have to keep our promises to the people who we promised safe passage for if they helped us. And first and foremost, because we made a promise and their lives are now in danger. And these people who helped us translate and who contracted with us and helped us to learn and know their culture and how to operate within their culture effectively, who have now been abandoned. I think it is not only a terrible humanitarian reality to abandon refugees in this moment, especially the ones who we promised we would get out, but also it demolishes our reputation on the international scale. Should we ever go back into a conflict and approach local people and say, if you help us, we will give you a visa or we'll make you a citizen? What on earth reason would they have to trust us if we don't make good on the promise in Afghanistan? Now, it'll be a devastating reality for our foreign policy from this point forward. So it's definitely a twofold thing: allowing refugees to leave and welcoming those who we promised into our own country with open arms and saying, here's a new life. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for your family's sacrifice. I don't see how we have any other option in that regard. I think that on a more strategic level, and this is where I'll go to Department of State or Langley and tell them all my ideas. But I do think we have to support. I think we have to support people who are pushing for alternative realities in Afghanistan. Because it's like there's different realities, right? It doesn't have to be like an all or nothing type thing. I mean, people they join political parties for different reasons. Like maybe we have some of the same leaders who are currently now in power, but who have their minds changed about how to treat their people and how to respect human rights. And maybe there's middle ground to be investigated, and it doesn't have to be an all or nothing scenario. So I think that we as a country, if we are going to do anything, which right now part of me thinks that we should be taking a seat for a minute to think, but if we do anything, it should be helping Afghans find that middle ground toward humanitarian and civil rights.
I agree with so much of what you're saying, Charles. And I also know that historically, Afghanistan has been this enigma that many countries try to intervene with or maybe try to control, and it has never worked. There is something special about that country, and I have to believe that God has a special destiny for it, and maybe they have reached that point where, if they're willing to see God, if they're willing to open their eyes to maybe something different than what they have believed before, they can have the guidance, they can have the right answers to their problems. So I think that we should continue to pray for the Church of Afghanistan, and they're at a very defining moment for not only for their safety, but also for the future of their country. I believe that people who follow the true God have the true answers, not to their own personal future only, but to the future of their nation. So
I would challenge us as people who believe who are people of faith, to pray for the Islamic leaders as well. Like, you can pray for a Muslim leader to interpret his faith in such a way that it would lead for a better life for his people, the people of his country. There's a lot of space, right? In that, like, if you are using Islam to oppress people and to enact violence for control, what if we were to also pray for more respect in the Islamic community as well? I think that can be a big challenge for us as believers, that their interpretation of faith would be less violent and more humanitarian.
And that's true. And there are many great examples in the Bible of God favoring a leader who was not necessarily the follower of true God, but was a just leader, making wise decisions, and they received favor from God. So I completely agree with that as well. So thank you so much, Charles, for your time, taking time to talk on that subject and giving an insight on how we can pray for Afghanistan.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Helen.
Listening to Charles made me think that what is happening in Afghanistan today is symbolic of what is happening in the world. We face forces of darkness that threaten our peace, stability, and well-being. And putting hope for a better future in governments, no matter how stable or just they may seem, is an illusion that will be shattered sooner or later. But there is a better hope for the people of Afghanistan and for the rest of us. If you want to know more about Charles's work on bringing peace and the resolution of conflict, you will find a link to his website in the show notes. Now, will you join me and the World Missions Alliance family in praying for the protection of the church, the women, and other vulnerable people in Afghanistan, for leaders to be raised who will fight for freedom and safety and stability, and above all, for the light of Christ to shine over this nation and heal its land and its people? If you feel called specifically to missions, we would love to hear from you. You can learn more on how to become involved and how to connect with us on our website, which is rfwma.org. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Until next time, I'm Helen Todd.
Limitless Spirit Podcast is produced by World Missions Alliance. We believe that changed lives change lives. If you want to see your life transformed by Christ's love, or if you want to help those who are hurting and hopeless and discover your greater purpose in serving Christ through short-term missionary work, check out our website, rfwma.org, and find out how to get involved.